History of a Teacher by Famous Fault. Chapter 17. Yugi's Sword. Only a day after Tracy was released from the hospital, someone was banging on the door to Yugi's room. The simple fact that it was the door to his room, and not his office, on which they were banging, told Yugi that it could be no one else but Rebecca. It was quite early in the morning, and Yugi had barely woken. Dobby had already accompanied him, though, and was sitting on a chair at the round table. He was telling Yugi about all the things that happened in the kitchen, and before Rebecca's interruption, he had been telling Yugi that he nearly had saved enough for another pair of socks. "Hold on a second," he called towards the door in Japanese to make sure that it was Rebecca. When the banging stopped, he assumed that it was. No one else there would have understood him. He put on his shoes and blue jacket, a remainder of his previous school uniform, which to his great disappointment still fitted. He opened the door to see Rebecca stand before him with thunderclouds over her head, but when he looked closer, she seemed to be more worried than mad. "Rebecca?" Yugi asked, concerned, and opened the door further so she could enter. "What are you doing? You're so early." The thunderclouds evaporated in a matter of seconds, and Rebecca sat down next to Dobby. She still hadn't really noticed the house elf. "I wanted to come yesterday afternoon, but I stayed with Tracy the whole night, so I slept the entire day and night yesterday. Now I really have to tell you something." Yugi, who knew Rebecca well enough to recognize the sense of fear and doubt she showed, sat down opposite her. "What is it? Tell me." "You know that shadow creatures are able to act on their own, right?" she asked. To Yugi's great surprise, he hadn't been aware of how much she knew about the powers of the Millennium items. Yugi fingered a bit with the little red bag around his neck and frowned. "It's not me you should ask about that. I do not know. It's not quite clear to me. Atem hasn't told me everything, and I could mess things up. Ask him." "You both have to hear this. I didn't really get it, so I hope you can help," she said, speaking far faster than Yugi could ever imagine to do so himself. "Okay, I'll let you speak to Atem. I'll listen," Yugi said, and withdrew so Atem could take his place. Yugi sat down in spirit form next to Atem, invisible to Rebecca. "Tell us," Atem said with his most serious voice, a voice that, if used in the correct way, made a world listen without protesting to the spoken words. Rebecca, however, knew Atem too well and wasn't the type to be intimidated, so instead of reacting to the tone like everyone else would have done, she just repeated her previous question. Atem nodded. "Yes, I knew. The shadow creatures aided their masters during the war and were definitely capable of thinking for themselves. However, they were trapped in their tablets. They couldn't leave them without being called upon by a person wielding a Millennium item. The shadows would stop them." Rebecca nodded. "As I thought then. Who controls the shadows?" "That would be me," Atem said, and frowned, his scarlet eyes staring straight into Rebecca's, as if he had tried to see what she was thinking. Rebecca nodded. Clearly she had known that too. "During the class in which you lost control over the shadows, during that time the shadows keeping the beasts locked away in their tablets, or actually cards now, weakened. Some beasts created a way to get in and out themselves. Firecracker informed me that they still were depending on the shadows and they couldn't stay outside long when not being called upon. But they can come out. Yesterday, Sangan saved my life. He just appeared out of nowhere." Atem rubbed his temples. "A lot went wrong that day." Then it was quiet for a minute. "What did he save you from?" he asked, disturbed when he realized what she had said. There was no way in the world that either Atem or Yugi would be able to stand by while one of their few remaining friends was threatened. Rebecca said, realizing she had said one thing too many. "Rebecca, if this is serious, you should tell us," Atem said. "You should face no danger alone." Rebecca smiled an uncomfortable smile and shifted in her seat. "I promised my attacker that I wouldn't tell anyone what happened. Let's just say it was an involuntary attack." Atem raised an eyebrow suspiciously but didn't press on. "Okay," he said. "I'll rely on your judgment. Now, did the firecracker say anything more?" Rebecca thought a long while before answering. "Yes, he told me a bit about the tomb robber and Zork and his priest. But you already told me about that. He didn't say much else. He seemed to find it hard to speak." She didn't think it would be wise to tell Atem and Yugi about the fact that the Kraken had told her that it was up to her to break the spiral they were in. She hadn't liked the tinge to the Kraken's exact choice of words and doubted that Atem or Yugi would. Atem said, and seemed to be lost in thought. Yugi watched his best friend carefully. Eventually he spoke.
Have you ever heard of the dominion of the beasts?
It sounds vaguely familiar, Rebecca said with a frown.
It's unfortunate that I know that Sengen and Firecracken indeed both are creatures of the shadows and not the Dominion. See, the Dominion is the place our cars go when we die. Those help us out sometimes when they can cross from their world to ours without trouble. The Dark Magician girl saved me and Yugi from drowning once. It would be tempting to say that they were simply from the Dominion and that we shouldn't worry, but they clearly are not. In fact, Firecracken was one of Shimon's creatures once upon a time.
The Dominion, Rebecca mused. The monster sightings! Adem nodded.
Indeed, they all fled their world because it was being attacked by Leviathan and the Orichalcos.
Adem shrugged.
They aided us in that battle and left, like they did 10,000 years ago. Just like the creatures of shadows, they are linked to their respective cards. The difference is that beasts from the Dominion can choose to come when summoned, while shadow creatures have to come, whether they want or not. Though only when used by or against a shadow wielder. At least that was until now.
Can't we just let them all go to the Dominion? I mean, they seem to have it loads better there. Besides, wouldn't a lot of the shadow powers disappear if that happened? Rebecca wondered, with a look in her eyes that neither Atem nor Yugi had ever seen before. It was sympathy, Atem realized, slightly surprised. Never had he seen Rebecca being sympathetic before. I mean, they don't seem to like it in there.
They mostly don't. But, Rebecca, what you are saying makes sense. If the beasts would disappear from the shadows, the last thing to empower them would disappear, and the shadows would cease to exist. As Atem spoke the words, a bolt of lightning came down upon him. He knew how to rid the world of the shadows.
Atem, that's great! Yugi said, carefully enthusiastic. He sensed the uncertainty that held Atem in its grip.
Atem shook his head. So now I know how to rid this world of the shadows, a power so dark that it should not exist.
Atem told both Yugi and Rebecca.
But I can't do it.
Why not? Yugi and Rebecca asked simultaneously.
The shadow creatures are depending on the shadows. If they were to be removed from their prisons for too long, they'd fade away, cease to exist. I can't do that. These creatures have a will and a mind of their own. They were the most vital part of a human soul. I can't vaporize them for something like this. We are talking about many thousand creatures who'd all be exterminated. As soon as they are captured, they become dependent on the shadows. Didn't Firecracker tell you?
He added at last. Rebecca thought for a while and then nodded. Well, I said so, didn't I? Yes, you did. Then we can't do that. Anyway, even if we'd rid this world of the shadows, that would do you little good, Yugi told Atem with a deep sigh. Atem nodded, thinking about the future frightened him, though he'd never admit that. Problem, cause, solution, Rebecca said after the four of them sat silent for a while. Make creatures independent of shadows! A high-pitched voice squeaked, and Yugi smiled at Dobby. The house elf saw things very simply. Rebecca, who hadn't noticed the house elf despite the fact that she was sitting next to him, jumped in surprise. Who are you? My name is Dobby, the house elf said, confident, and gave Rebecca a huge smile. Dobby is a house elf, ma'am. Rebecca, who had gotten over her surprise swiftly, smiled back and held out a hand. Hello, Dobby. My name is Rebecca. To both Atem and Rebecca's surprise, Dobby started crying. Hogwarts is home of many good wizards and witches. So good to Dobby. So nice to Dobby.
Dobby,
Atem said calmly.
That's not something you should be grateful for. That's something you should expect.
Dobby looked at Atem, and tears made a wet trail on the elf's face. It wasn't until now that Atem realized that Dobby was holding a sword in his hands. The very same sword that Yugi had driven through the door when it once again had reminded him of the day he most of all wanted to forget. Atem hadn't even realized that it had been removed from the door. He had assumed Yugi had done it when he had been distracted from the real world, which happened quite often. Clearly Yugi had not.
Dobby, why are you holding that sword?
Atem asked carefully. Dobby suddenly stopped crying and looked at the heavy thing in his arms. Dobby cleaned it for you, Pharaoh, sir, after Yugi, sir, put it in the door, Dobby said, and Atem received a confused glance from Rebecca.
Thank you, Dobby,
Atem said, uncertain about what to say. It's a very beautiful sword. Where did Pharaoh, sir, get it? Then Dobby realized who he was talking to and seemed to become pale. Dobby does not wish to pay. He's just He started panicking. Atem cut him off.
Curious, I know. You are probably the most curious being I've ever encountered, but it could get you into danger, Dobby. Now please leave. The less you know, the better, Dobby.
Atem knelt down so he could look the elf in the eyes.
I don't want you to die, Dobby, but if someone finds out you know too much, you will. Neither me nor Yugi wants to lose another friend, so hurry off.
The face of the elf lit up in the same way as the landscape lightens when a lightning bolt strikes it. Did Pharaoh, sir, just call Dobby a friend? New tears started to gather in his large round eyes.
Yes, Dobby, you are a friend.
Atem said and smiled a smile that Rebecca had never seen before. Never had she encountered the ancient being living in the Millennium Puzzle this way, relaxed and with only people he cared about. It brought out a side in him that strongly reminded her of the fact that he, too, was human. With a happy swirl and a loud crack, the elf left, leaving the sword on the table. Rebecca crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow at Atem. A sword? She asked. Don't tell me the rumors were true.
Atem shrugged. Yugi lost his patience with the door. I can't blame him.
Where did you get that thing from? She wondered while she shook her head. You know there is a High Inquisitor running around looking for a reason to fire you. If these kind of things keep happening, she'll have you out of here in no time.
She won't need the sword as an excuse to throw me and Yugi out. I already made sure that half the 5th years have PTSD, and I have submitted her to a shadow game. The only thing she needs to do and attempt to kick us out is courage. And she doesn't have that. As for the sword, I believe that's more up to Yugi to tell.
With those words, Atem drew back, leaving Yugi in control. This sword, Yugi said, as if he'd never been gone, and put a hand on the blade gently, has a story which I did not know. I obtained it in Egypt. I believe I'll have to go further back than that, though. Let's start at the beginning. Sit down, he said and gestured towards the chair Rebecca had been sitting on until Dobby had startled her. Yugi sat down again, too. Mokuba, Ryo, and I, we didn't think. The same instant the killing curse had found its way into the spirit realm, the tomb started collapsing. Lucius Malfoy just kept firing killing curses at us way faster than any of us could react. Then it disappeared. As the ceiling was coming down, Mokuba grabbed Ryo's arm and dragged him out of the tomb. Ryo, just like me, had been frozen to the spot. Mokuba saved his life. I just stared at the dead people on the ground, people that only a minute ago had been my friends and family. I remember thinking that it suddenly had turned so quiet. It wasn't at all, but that's what it felt like. Yugi was quiet a couple of seconds, lost in thoughts, and Rebecca held her breath in horror. I would have allowed the tomb to kill me, hadn't it been for Atem. I thought he was gone too. He had disappeared as soon as the door closed, and I don't know what I thought. I guess I assumed that he was dead too, quite foolishly. Atem already was dead. Then I heard his voice in my head like so many times before. It was weird, since I already had accepted the fact that I'd never hear that again. Run, he yelled. I just obeyed. You do not argue with him when he sounds like that. I've never heard him so frightened before. I hope I never will again. Yugi buried his face in his hands and swallowed. He wiped his face dry. He had never told anyone this before, and it was hard. Very hard. I got out, and the first thing I see is Mokuba crying. He was the only one that cried at the time. I think he and Atem were the only ones who understood what had just happened. I didn't hear anything from Atem the remainder of the day. Not the following few days, either. He grieved in the far corner of his soul room. Mokuba called the Alarm Central and Kaiba Corp. He was the only one able to function. Ryo just stared at the staircase leading down to the tomb the entire time. Ryo had been freed from the priest, and the same day he lost all the people he cared about. I just sat down and stared at the blue sky. I had known that I'd be leaving that place with a loss, but I hadn't expected it to play out quite like that. Ambulances arrived, police, and I don't know what. I wasn't that attentive. The paramedics questioned me. They soon figured out that I was just fine, although in heavy shock. Ryo was brought to the hospital. He had broken his arm, hit by a piece of the roof. When they forced him into the ambulance, was the last time I saw him. Mokuba and I returned to the city together. The police asked us some questions, and with a few swift lies from Mokuba's side, the case was closed. Mokuba asked me whether I wanted to fly home with him or stay for the funerals of the Ishtars, since I was the person that knew them best. When he asked that, I snapped back to life and told him that I would stay in Egypt a while. I didn't go to their funerals. Some of Ishizu's co-workers showed up, but since Ishizu had been quite secretive of her background and private life, she had only been on an acquaintance level with them, and none of them cried properly. They were buried. Had I had a say in it, they would have been cremated and scattered in the desert. Merrick's been underground long enough. I don't think he wanted to spend eternity there. I suppose I can only blame myself. I disappeared the moment Mokuba's plane left. I just took what I had and ran off. I started to ask around about man with white blonde hair and a black coat. I figured such a man would stand out, and it didn't take long before I had bait. Or actually, I walked straight into a trap. Lucius had paid some thugs to take care of anyone who asked after him. I hadn't even time to finish my description before the thug attacked. He attacked me with that very sword. Yugi gave the sword on the table a nod. Had he just shot me, I'd have been dead. I don't know why he chose such an old artifact to fight, but it doesn't really care. At that point, I thought I was alone. I thought that I only had imagined Atem's voice in my head when he told me to run, but that day he appeared again and asked me if he could take care of the thug. He did. The thug was hospitalized with a few fingers less, and I took the sword. I've never given either the sword nor the thug much thought. I was far too busy to ask Atem what, why, how, and once I was done with that, I had forgotten about them. Few fingers less? Rebecca asked with an expression that clearly showed her disbelief. I wasn't attentive to whatever Atem did to the thugs. I was far too surprised by the fact that Atem was still around. Yugi said in a casual voice that did not suit his words. I believe it was a way for him to relieve his anger. Rebecca just stared at Yugi, unsure about what to say, thus saying nothing. Yugi frowned as he saw the tears gather in Rebecca's eyes, tears the blonde wasn't aware of herself. Rebecca, I'm sorry, that probably sounded very wrong. It was a weird time those first few weeks, and I can't recall them in any other way than how I just put them, Yugi said, apologizing. Rebecca shook her head and wiped her tears away. Yugi knew very well how much Rebecca hated to cry and ignored them tactfully. Rebecca spoke. That just clashes with everything I've ever thought about you. I know that things have changed a lot since the first time we met, but I just can't comprehend all this. You shouldn't apologize for what happened then. At least, I don't think you should. Yugi gave Rebecca a careful smile. The worst had blown over, but it was still slightly awkward. All right, Yugi said eventually, with the tone of a person that had found the perfect question in an awkward silence. Now we've told you about the sword. It's only fair you tell us something. Rebecca frowned, but simply waited for Yugi to continue as the Japanese picked up the sword and put it under his bed. In a few days, the first Quidditch match will be played between Slytherin and Gryffindor. Now tell me, what on earth is Quidditch? A frosty November morning, Yugi made his way towards the Quidditch pitch. Never in all his years of school had he seen such an empathy for sport. It was simply weird. Rebecca hadn't been able to explain to him how the game worked. She had gotten Peter Leppard, who had explained the sport to the two of them, once he had gotten over the surprise that they didn't know it. It had become a surprising comfy afternoon, despite their rough start. Yugi didn't like the cold, he probably never would, but he didn't dislike it as much as the former pharaoh, who plainly refused to be the one taking the cold. His opinion was that since he was dead anyway, he should have the right to the few advantages of it, and Yugi couldn't deny his friend that. Most of the teachers were already there, not affected by the cold as much as Yugi and Atem. Yugi carefully slid down in the last remaining free seat next to the dark student Yugi knew to be Lee Jordan, a sixth year that was the partner in crime of the infamous Weasley twins. Lee Jordan said a quick hello, without really saying who had come to sit next to him. Yugi could hear the singing, and he felt sorry for the redhead in his fifth year. That had been one of the exact reasons why Yugi had never liked sports, the constant bullying. He was surprised to hear Atem commenting that thought.
Having to stand the bullying is a vital part of sports. If you're not capable enough to stand the taunting, you're definitely not able to stand the pressure during a match. It's a test. If you fail it, the team is better off with a different player. In addition to that, you get an additional adrenaline rush because you just have to prove that they're wrong.
Yugi decided not to comment that. He'd always known that Atem was far more of a sportsman than he was himself, but this he hadn't seen coming. He got a rather funny mental image of a Tem playing basketball in the attire Yugi had seen him wearing when back in the past.
Not basketball, perhaps, but I played both handball and equestrian sports. In addition to that, I practiced marathon running and archery.
Tem gave the annoyed younger a smile, then turned his attention on the pitch. In a single file line, they marched up the pitch, and Madame Hooch told the captains to shake hands. The hostility was nearly touchable. Both the Gryffindor and Slytherin captains tried to kill the other teams by glaring. So did many of the other players. To the surprise of the entire public, none of the fifth years did that same attempt. What's wrong with the fifth years? Jordan stared, his commenting, and Yugi finally realized what he was doing there. They look tame like lambs. Where is the fire? Many approving yells came from every part of the stadium. Crabbe, Goyle, Malfoy, Potter, and the youngest Weasley on the pitch looked at the ground, and Yugi closed his eyes. He knew very well where their fire had gone. They had left them round in about 60 years ago while suffering the horror of the concentration camps. Tem, who was standing in spirit form next to Yugi, closed his eyes and turned his face up towards the blue sky. Yugi knew that there was little he could say. Instead, he looked for Rebecca. She stood out in the crowd, since she had refused to pick a side and had thus decided to wear a white scarf. Their gazes crossed a second, and then both turned their attention back upon the pitch. Yugi didn't say anything as Madame Hooch blew the whistle, and the balls were released. Tem was watching the game carefully, while Yugi was watching Tem. Despite himself, Yugi couldn't help but laughing when Jordan started commenting for real. And it's Johnson with the quaffle. What a player that girl is. I've been saying it for years, but she still won't go out with me. Jordan! Professor McGonagall yelled furiously, and now even Tem smirked. Just a fun fact, Professor adds a bit of interest. And she's ducked Warrington. She's passed. Yugi couldn't follow the game all too well. Not that he really did an effort. Somewhere in the middle of the game, Madame Hooch flew straight through Tem and looked at Yugi. Beats card games, doesn't it? She asked and laughed. Then she mused, though for the world, I can't understand why the fifth years play so gentle. With that, she flew away. Yugi looked at Tem, but the spirit just shrugged. There was nothing he knew that lived up to the card games he had played. Nothing. Quidditch wasn't even close. Then, before Yugi was even aware of what was happening, the game was over. A victory for Gryffindor, at least according to Jordan. What he did see coming was the bludger. It hit Potter straight in the small of his back, throwing him off his broom, and the boy hit the frozen ground hard. Yugi watched the argument following with a passive interest that was only fitting for an observer. Then he slipped away before any of the teachers even had realized that there was an argument. He got as close to the fight as he could without being noticed and listened. Draco Malfoy was doing his very best to make Potter mad, though his progress was slow. He hadn't found the right words just yet. It were the Weasley twins who were the first to fall for Malfoy's plan and did an attempt to attack the blonde. Their teammates held them back. At last, Malfoy said the words to make Potter snap, and he released George. Together, they lunged for Malfoy. To everyone's surprise, Harry stopped in the middle of his leap and dropped his fists. He shook his head and backed up. Whispers went through the crowd, but as George hit his target, Harry's hesitation was forgotten by the crowd. Turns out your actions during that devastating class led to the reduction of violence in the school, Yugi stated and looked at the spirit hovering next to him. Tem frowned at Yugi's words, but didn't react further. It was the kind of comment that Yugi wouldn't have been able to make before Lucius Malfoy made his dramatic debut. Mr. Weasley, I think that's quite enough, Yugi said lowly, and to everyone's surprise, including Yugi's, George Weasley stopped and turned around to face the much shorter person. It was a wonder that the redhead even had been able to hear him over the yells, even more so that he actually listened. Madame Hooch threw Yugi a grateful look and took over from there, while Yugi departed. Swiftly, he left for his room, not feeling like talking to anyone. Halfway there, he sighed, closed his eyes, and turned around.
Yugi, you might not be a saint, but you still get well close to it,
Tem remarked with a hint of a smile. Yugi hung his head and dragged his feet towards McGonagall's office. A couple of minutes later, he was standing outside the office, his hand raised to knock, but then he changed his mind. He had to keep a low profile if he still wanted to be able to pull some strings here and there. Besides, he didn't really feel like interrupting an argument between McGonagall and Umbridge anyway, so he turned around once again and left the hallway just in time to avoid running into a very satisfied Umbridge.